Welcome to Intermediate Macro. I'm Dr. Dangerous Dave, and we're going to talk about
The myth of macro.
people have been writing about supply and demand since at least the 14th century. It was James Denham Stewart who came up with the phrase supply and demand in 1767 that Adam Smith liked so much he used it 9 years later. David Ricardo, on the other hand, in 1817, decided he preferred demand and supply, and that debate has continued ever since. The point is that by the middle of the 19th century, economists were drawing supply and demand plots. And by the 1920s, the mechanisms of market clearing equilibrium were pretty well understood. That is, in a market for a good with lots of suppliers, lots of consumers, and lots of transactions, there is some equilibrium price at which the market clears. We can see how all this works in the market for a single good or service by peeling the layers back. We understand production functions on the supply side. We sort of understand utility functions on the demand side. And we see how arbitrage or freely available information lubricate the price discovery process. Mechanics are easy to see in a market for vegetables, in a fish market, with online auctions, or stock exchanges. But what gave birth to the field of macroeconomics in the 1930s was the myth that the entire national economy can be described with the same model used with a market for a single good or service. On the demand side, it might make a certain amount of sense to add up all the demand curves for all the goods and services purchased by all the nation's population. We call that aggregating. That comes from the Latin aggregare, meaning to herd, as in sheep. On the supply side, however, aggregating all the supply curves of all the goods produced was pretty radical in the early 20th century. And that's because the classical view was that national production was fixed, that is, constant, at some natural level. However firmly economists in the early 20th century believed that national output was fixed at some natural rate, it was a simple matter of observation to see that sometimes the economy grew and sometimes it shrank. And the classical model couldn't account for that. So suppose now we put an A for aggregate in front of supply, and an A for aggregate in front of demand. And now we have the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, or the ASAD model. But what's on the price axis? That's a complexity we skipped over when we were talking about aggregating supply and demand. Think about it. We're putting all the goods in the economy in these curves, from chewing gum to aircraft carriers. What do we put on the price axis? Here's the especially creative part of the ASAD model. We'll call it aggregate price. And what does that mean? Well, it means that at about the middle, prices are about what they should be. Above that, prices are higher than they should be, and below that, prices are lower than they should be. Now remember, this is a model of the national economy. Every student of physics knows that inclined planes with no friction and spherical cows with no wind resistance really don't exist. So should every student of economics know that the national economy doesn't really reach equilibrium between aggregate supply and aggregate demand at some single market clearing aggregate price. Still, we can learn some really interesting things about the macroeconomy using the ASAD model. We'll see the few times that it actually describes the macroeconomy well. And we'll see many others when it does not. And the battle of whether to say supply and demand or to say demand and supply still rages. So some authors will call this the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, or ADAS model. It's no different. Though supply and demand seems to trip off the vernacular tongue easily, and I think ASAD has a nicer ring to it.